On August 4th, 2020, the Great American Outdoors Act was signed into law. It has been hailed as the greatest conservation legislation in a generation, allocating billions of dollars for deferred maintenance on America's public lands. This legislation has been needed for a long time. The deferred maintenance backlog on our public lands has steadily grown for decades now. The aging infrastructure is crumbling, and limited funding prioritizes long-term projects and land acquisition rather than maintenance. The Great American Outdoors Act won't solve this problem overnight, but it is the first step in addressing an issue that has plagued our public lands for far too long. This is the Great American Outdoors Act, explained. In order to understand why the Great American Outdoors Act is such a crucial piece of public lands legislation, let's talk a little bit more about that deferred maintenance backlog. Current estimates place the total maintenance backlog for America's public lands at around $20 billion, with nearly $12 billion required at national parks alone. More than half of the national park backlog has to deal with roads and other transportation infrastructure, while the rest addresses things like trail and building maintenance, visitor centers, water and sewer systems, dams, marinas, and much more. And there are several reasons why the backlog has gotten as big as it has. First, public lands infrastructure is just really old. 70% of the backlog in national parks is for fixing infrastructure that's more than 60 years old. The older this infrastructure gets, the costlier it is to maintain. The National Park Service also manages the second highest number of assets in the entire federal government, second only to the Department of Defense. So not only is the infrastructure old, there's a lot of it. Park visitation continues to rise as well. In 2019, the National Park System saw over 320 million visitors, an increase of nearly 50% since 1980. On top of this, national park funding has largely stagnated in this time. The available funding is mostly allocated for larger, multi-year projects or land acquisition, both of which have to be maintained. This further balloons maintenance costs. This means more people than ever are visiting our public lands, but those lands are consistently underfunded and filled with aging infrastructure. And that's where the Great American Outdoors Act comes into play. This law specifically addresses deferred maintenance on public lands, with the aim of providing much-needed funding to our national parks, forests, wildlife refuges, and other areas. The Act has two main components. First, it creates the National Park and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund. This fund will provide up to $9 billion over 5 years for public lands maintenance, with roughly $1.9 billion provided annually. Funding will be distributed proportionally based on how big each agency's backlog is, meaning the National Park Service, with its expansive maintenance backlog, will receive 70% of the funding. The Forest Service will receive 15%, the Fish and Wildlife Service 5%, the Bureau of Land Management 5%, and the Bureau of Indian Education 5%. The money for the fund will come from energy development revenue on public lands. Half of all energy development revenue will be deposited into the fund, whereas before, this amount went directly into the United States General Treasury. The reason this funding is specifically for deferred maintenance is so resources aren't further overextended and maintenance backlogs don't continue to grow. Interestingly, 65% of the funding must be used on non-transportation related maintenance, despite this being the largest portion of the backlog. This is mainly due to the fact that other agencies oversee transportation infrastructure on public lands. The second component of the Great American Outdoors Act is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Unlike the Legacy Restoration Fund, the Land and Water Conservation Fund is an existing funding source. It was created in 1965 and has been a popular source of funding for conservation projects since its inception. The LWCF provides funding for both land acquisition and recreation projects, as well as special projects determined by Congress. It's similar to the Legacy Restoration Fund in that it is funded through energy development revenue, although the LWCF is funded through royalties on energy development rather than revenues from that development. The LWCF is supposed to be funded with $900 million annually, but because this money had to be specifically allocated by Congress rather than automatically deposited, it was rarely fully funded. That is, until the Great American Outdoors Act was passed. The Act fully funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund in perpetuity. I think it's also worth mentioning that the Great American Outdoors Act was passed with a relatively bipartisan effort. It passed the Senate 73-25 and passed the House 310-107. Many believe that the coronavirus pandemic played a key role in its approval, given how crucial national parks and public lands are to the economies of many Western states and the impact the pandemic has had on those economies. It's estimated that national parks contributed nearly $40 billion to the U.S. economy in 2019 and supported more than 340,000 jobs. But the coronavirus pandemic has hit border towns and national park communities particularly hard because of its impact on the tourism industry. The Great American Outdoors Act is expected to add roughly 108,000 new jobs in an effort to reinvigorate the economies of these public lands communities. These economic benefits, plus the historic popularity of national parks, are ultimately what drove the rare bipartisan effort to pass this historic piece of conservation legislation. And of course, there's more to do. Our public lands are in constant need of support, funding, and protection. But for today, the Great American Outdoors Act stands as a towering piece of public lands legislation, a credit to the importance of protecting public lands for generations to come. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing below. Stay tuned for more parks and protected lands content. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.